All kinds of stuff you can do with these things. I got into DJing when I was a young teen. I was listening to hip hop, hearing scratches on records. A lot of people who grew up on 90s hip hop tried messing around with scratching. For whatever reason, when I tried it, it sounded like scratching. And that's kind of what started my whole journey. My history with Pioneer and AlphaTheta started with the mixers. But somewhere along the way, a couple years ago, I just fully dove into, the record box approach of using CDJs with a flash drive. The more sort of recent CDJs had like bigger and bigger screens, and I think that helped me let go of the laptop too. I was kind of seduced by the idea that there's new things you can do on a CDJ that you can't do on a turntable. And I remember that was kind of a breakthrough, kind of a light bulb moment for me, where initially I thought that I would need to translate my craft from what I've always done on turntables to the CDJ, and trying to look for this sort of like one-to-one translation. There was this sort of aha moment of like, let me just get accustomed to using this new piece of machinery the way that it really is designed to work, as opposed to trying to recreate what I do on a turntable. Once I got in that mindset, I started looking at these CDJs and being like, well, wait a second, this thing has a pitch control that goes plus minus 50. I'm used to turntables that go plus minus 8. I could do a whole bunch of stuff with this. The loop is really accurate. Of course, there's, even in the earlier CDJs, I'm talking about like almost 20 years ago, there's already, the waveform display on the screen that's giving me different kinds of information. And even just like the cue button itself having like this stuttery sound that could be implemented in my style of mixing. So I just started looking at this piece of equipment and thinking like, this could be just a new instrument for me. Looking at these AlphaTheta CDJ-3000Xs, probably the biggest first impression is bigger display. I'm always down for bigger screen, more real estate, just more information. There's like a little bit of a matte finish to these units that feels luxurious. Some of the buttons have a little bit of a different feel, but functionality-wise, USB-C, I feel like we knew that was going to happen. There's this one feature that I really like here. It's called gate cue. And, I do a lot of tricks with hot cues where I'm setting these hot cues to different sounds. Sometimes it's even like little sound effects and one-shots. Could even be within a track. And I can show an example of where this is really practical. Up until now, when you would hit a hot cue, it would start playback from that point. So, on this beat here, if I have hot cues set to even just like a kick, a snare, and a hi-hat, what would happen is if I would try to drum out a beat, like essentially if I'm using this like a sampler pad or something, up until now, if I would hit, for instance, that hi-hat, it would continue playing, and pretty quickly you would hear the next sound after, So I'm hitting a hat, but I'm getting a snare right after. Gate cue turns this into a sort of gated trigger where you're only hearing the sound for as long as you're pressing the button. So for these kinds of drumming tricks or like one-shot tricks, I can isolate sounds in a cleaner way. Like similarly on this little beat. So this is the way that the cues were before, where every time I hit it, it plays from that point, which is cool. For a break like that, it can work. But if I'm playing that over a beat and I have that sort of bleed, I might want to turn on the gate cue. And it just gives me more options to get choppy if I want. So, I could even do one of these over the other. So More options. I love options. I also noticed that if you're inside of a playlist, you now have the ability to rearrange your track order here with this edit button. So you literally just, select a track and move it up or down. That's really cool too, because I think we've all been in situations where you just feel like you have to go back to the laptop to make any changes to something like track orders. So yeah, those are kind of like my first impressions. I like the fact that these are similar enough to CDJ-3000s, but with a little bit of a upgraded touch, bigger screens, and a few options like the ones I just showed where I'm like, I could use this, like this will be a nice bonus. Remixing is how I taught myself how to produce. When I decided to take production more seriously, and I was kind of like, all right, let me actually figure out how to make a track from soup to nuts and get it to sound right so I can play it in the club. The first couple of things I did were remixes, because remixes give you a starting point, and you can have something that you can produce around. So I got used to grabbing, whether it be a vocal or some sort of loopable or choppable, piece of music, and figuring out what kind of drums to put to it, how to process it, how to find a groove with that. And there's a lot of times where I have started a piece of music, in certain cases even recorded a vocal to kind of a temporary beat, taken it home, remove all the music, keep the vocal, and decide, let me remix that. And that's become the final song. I think that that's just where I get my best ideas, is when I put my mind into this sort of like, can I flip this kind of approach, And then that will also happen in my sets, where there's a ton of stuff that I do that's completely improvised. My sets aren't planned, but I do have an arsenal of certain tricks. But most of the time, those tricks started with something that I improvised at some show and that I decided to keep. All right, so I'm gonna demonstrate just a little bit of scratching. Something I do at my shows sometimes is I'll grab kind of like a long riser kind of sound. So something that sounds like this. That always sounds good if I do what's called a transformer scratch, which is kind of a rhythmic scratch on the crossfader. I will demonstrate scratching on a riser sound effect over a house beat. Now I have a couple of record labels that are all kind of part of the same umbrella. My friends and I launched Fool's Gold really around the same time that I was taking my own production more seriously too. It was also kind of a pivotal point in like my growth and my path, where I went from being like the young guy in the crew when I was doing like the DJ competitions and like learning how to scratch around all these older DJs, to realizing that things had flipped around. And as I was starting Fool's Gold with my friends, and as I was not only starting to produce with friends and peers, but was also in a position to release music that I was excited about, that I was finding, you know, in our scene and just kind of around us in our friend group, that put me, you know, in a position where I could champion other people's music and have a platform to get it heard and kind of become a mentor more and more myself. And that's something that I've really enjoyed with having Fool's Gold as a label over the years. And then more recently, actually just earlier this year, I launched A-Trak and Friends as kind of a sub-label of Fool's Gold. And that was originally just a series of parties that we were doing that were called A-Trak and Friends. And those parties were really specialized in house music, in contrast to like the more eclectic styles of Fool's Gold. And then I ended up launching A-Trak and Friends as a label for house singles, you know, where a lot of what I signed is things that I would play in my sets, basically. So all the tracks that I'll be using today are on my label, Fool's Gold, as well as the A-Trak and Friends sub-label. So I grabbed from the two pots and came up with a few things. So we got these nice big screens on the AlphaTheta CDJ-3000X. That just gives me so much more information of even just what's on my waveform, what's in these tracks, what's coming up, and all the way down to things that I might have ideas to create loops on the fly. So for instance, something like this where I'm just spontaneously looping a section. Of course, I could do this on any CDJ model, and we've all done this before. I just think that the more I'm seeing on these displays, the more information I have and the more I'm sure which section I'm going to. Because for instance, if I move my loop over just a little earlier in this sort of breakdown, and I'm using the beat jump function here that keeps me on grid, those red transients, I know that that looks like a kick. Indeed, there's a kick there. So I just know visually as this breakdown is coming that this section here that doesn't have those red kind of transients is going to be more of an open music loop. So it just kind of allows me to make decisions even faster on the fly, where I remember that there's this horn section that opens up during the breakdown. Visually, my brain just goes, that's where I'll hit loop. And once I loop it up, I can just go choose some drums from another record and, you know, blend them on top. And then I start having fun with it. And I could just keep going with it. But even there, I went from a 1-bar loop to a half-bar loop with the help of what I'm seeing on the display screen. It's nice to know that whatever city you're in, you could just walk into Guitar Center, you kind of know what it's going to look like, what section to go to. But it's also been fun to have gotten to work with Guitar Center a little bit over the years. And highlight of that, it was 2018. There was this big reopening of the classic Sunset Boulevard Hollywood Guitar Center store. There was a block party for that reopening, and I got to DJ at that block party. So that was definitely a highlight of my relationship with the company. I'm going to play around with two tracks again. Both of these tracks are pretty stripped down in production. It's kind of just drums and bass lines. One of them has a vocal loop that's kind of fun. So I'm really just going to improvise, but have both of them playing at the same time and see what I can turn it into. You know, sometimes it's just playing with obviously cutting the bass and filters, and you kind of create a little bit of a build-up or an energy when they're all running together. So let's see.
Phone up myself, phone up my, phone up my, phone up myself, phone up myself, phone up my, phone up my, phone up myself, phone up myself, phone up my, phone up my, phone up myself, phone up myself, phone up myself, phone up my, phone up myself, phone up myself, phone up my, phone up my, phone up myself, 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 phone up my, phone up myself,
Nitty gritty
just kind of improvising some loops together. And again, the fact that I have so much information visually, it just kind of helps me decide when I'm going to turn on one loop. And even just when there was a point where this track had the bass line comes in kind of almost halfway in. So in the beginning, I've got the bass line from this one running, and this is just vocals and a kick drum and some shakers. And then I know that when I get to this C hot cue that's pretty far in, I can switch over and get this bass line going. So using that visual information and, you know, having fun with the effects on the mixer to keep the groove going. Most DJs are used to the existing CDJ-3000, so I think it's going to be pretty easy for pretty much every DJ to jump onto these. There's not really a learning curve. And I can even just say for myself, I haven't even delved into the cloud stuff and everything that comes with the Wi-Fi connectivity of these units. So, you know, that's a whole other, you know, dimension that I'm gonna have to dive into. I just went straight into my kinds of tricks because that's my comfort zone. But yeah, I think that's what's great about these is that they feel familiar enough, but there's also enough new features that you can actually dive in and have fun with it.